Hello and welcome to Matrix Live, the show to tell you what's happening in Matrix, the open protocol for decentralized and secure communications. For the past few episodes, I had a few guests who told me how cool it was to build products on top of Matrix because they could build the product without having to change the specification, the Matrix specification, and they could later upstream the changes in the spec. Today, my guest is Andrew Morgan from the Spec Core Team, who has a focus on servers, app services, and especially the spec process. Andrew is going to help me answer the question, how can everybody add features to Matrix and how can those features make it to the specifications? I'm tempted to dive in directly to the spec process, but maybe we need to take a step back and start by the beginning for people who are not familiar with Matrix. Andrew, can you tell us in the Matrix protocol, what are the different entities involved and how they are related to each other?
Yeah, sure. So hello, everyone. So in terms of understanding Matrix, there's a few different components at a high level. So obviously you have what's known as a client. This is the application that you run on your phone or your laptop. It could be something like Element or Fluffy Chat or Neko, if you've heard of those. And this is what you interact with as a user. This client will talk to a server. That's something that's typically up there in the cloud. And this server will keep track of all of your messages, and it will talk to other servers that other users are using. And their servers will talk to their clients. So you effectively end up with this two-tiered system where you have something that's kind of analogous to email, where you'll have some sort of email server like Gmail or Yahoo, and your own device will talk to the server. Your device can go offline, and the server will just keep running and keep things up to date, even if you lose your phone or laptop or what have you. So those are the two main components, the client and the server. You also have some other components such as application services. You might have heard of these for the use of bridging if you want to connect to other third-party networks. And then some even more out there ones such as identity servers and push servers, but those are more technical, so we probably won't go into detail here.
You mentioned email as an analogy that could work for this. In the email world, we have servers talking to servers, client talking to servers, but clients don't talk to clients. How are things in the Matrix world? Do we have all the entities talking to each other, or are there groups of entities that can be grouped together? Like, for example, clients talking to servers but not to each other, like email.
Yeah, so how exactly do these different entities talk to each other? Well, they do so over an API. This stands for Application Programming Interface. And that's basically a technical way of saying this is a document of the language that these entities should use when communicating with each other. And we only have a few of these in Matrix, and they're defined for a client talking to a server talking to a server, and there is no one for clients talking to other clients. You might have heard of peer-to-peer matrix and, oh, there's no servers anymore. But actually the way that works is just the server is put on your laptop instead. But either way, yes, you typically have clients talking to servers and servers talking to servers, and these are defined in the matrix specification, which encapsulates these different application programming interface documents.
So the client server API and the server API describe what kind of call, what are the different possibilities for the various entities to ask for the other. For example, the client can ask to load the list of rooms or to send a message. So that's what the API describes. But the content of what is transported is described as an event. What is an event? And can you show me an event?
Ah, yeah, sure. So when describing an event, these are one of the fundamental building blocks in Matrix. Events exist in a room, and I can create them pretty easily with different Matrix clients that I have installed. This one here is element. Let me go ahead and create a test room. And to insert an event into this room, there's all sorts of different types of events that I could insert, but we'll start by just sending a message, which is a specific type of event. We'll say, hello Matrix Live. And there we go. It's been sent into the room, and my client has rendered it like a chat message. Now, something that's useful is I can go in and view the source of this message, which is actually showing me the contents, what the event is actually made up of. And we can see here that it is just a JSON object. And if people aren't familiar with JSON, it's essentially a way of representing data with a field name and a value. And you can see here we have a field called type, a field called content, and inside of content we have some other fields, body, message type, and each one of these have values. So type is m.room.message, and then say the body of this event inside of content is hello Matrix Live, and my client is able to understand all of that and render it out to look like this.
Okay, so an event is a JSON object which can contain arbitrary data. So anything I want, really. It doesn't need to be inside the specification. I can send anything. So there are still some technical fields that are interesting that are in the specification that I cannot put whatever I want inside that. Well, I technically can, but if I want it to work properly, I need to take care of what I'm putting in those fields. The fields I have in mind are the type and content one. Can you expand on what they are and what they do and how they work?
Sure, lots of questions. Yeah, so you're right. So you can't just send an arbitrary JSON blob to the server expecting an event to come out the other side. There are some things that are required, and the spec tells you what things that the server expects from the client when sending an event. So the fields you mentioned, type, it's pretty self-explanatory. It essentially says what is the type of this event. And the server will recognize certain types that have been specified already, but it will also allow arbitrary types, and it should, if properly formatted, pass those through into the room so that other clients can make use of them. So for instance, if I want to send a generic message, the type of that is m.room.message. Now the m in front, m dot, is special. That is only specified once an event type has actually been included in the spec. So that's how you know that it is a specified event type. And if you say the type of my event is m.room.message, the server will say, aha, I know what to do with that. I'm going to be looking for other fields that match what I expect for an m.room.message type. Those fields will be under the content field. Now, content is a dictionary, and there are lots of other fields that live under there. Pretty much every event has a content field, but the content of the content field depends on what the type of the event is. So if it's an m.room.message, inside of it will be, there has to be a field called message type, and that will tell other clients what the type of the message you're trying to send is. One particular message type that is specified is m.text. There's that m dot again. This is a message that contains text. Other ones are m.image, and you can use that for sending images. So these fields are required, but there are other fields which can be inserted. And because it's JSON, you can put whatever fields you like in there. That's okay. This is an extensible data storage mechanism, but the spec will say which fields are required for which types, and you will need to follow that, but you can put arbitrary data in there as well. if the client on the other side expects it.
Right, and you said something which is very interesting and which explain why people find the matrix specification to be so flexible, what the matrix protocol to be so flexible, and how they can build products. It's this type field. So if I send an event with a type that is not known by the matrix specification, it's not going to be dismissed. It's going to be transported. So matrix is going to be a dump pipe in a way, and I can transport my specific event, and my specific client that I'm trying to develop can still receive that event at the other end of the pipe and can do what it needs to do with that event. So that's how I can benefit from the existing ecosystem, the existing Matrix ecosystem to transport events that all of the other clients are going to ignore, but my specific clients are going to pass them and to do things with them.
Yeah. To expand on that, essentially, you are allowed to put anything in that type field. And as long as a client does not think, yes, that's in the spec, I need to do something special with that. If it's just something else, then the client should ignore it. And that means you can put any arbitrary data in there, and you can make your own custom clients, which do recognize your custom type, and they can go in and do whatever you like with the data, whereas other clients will not break when they see that unrecognized type.
Right, and there are different types of event, I think. Do you want to expand a little on what state events are?
Oh yeah, sure. So we've been talking about events in general so far, but state events are a special subclass of event, and they are treated in a slightly different way to standard events. The way you specify a event as a state event is you simply put a state underscore key field into the JSON blob of your event. And this has to be a string, but it could be an empty string, or you could fill it with some data. And state events will have a interesting behavior of always being available in its current form to the client. And what I mean by that is, for instance, we use this for membership events. What this means is it says whether you are, as a user, joined to a room, or you're banned from the room, or you're invited to the room. And you can only ever be one of these things at a time, right? So a good use case to represent this concept is a state event, where you say, okay, I've got an event, its type, still using type, is m.room.membership. The state key, I'm going to set to the user's ID, their matrix ID. And what happens is when I send one of these, if one already exists with the same type and state key, that will override the previous value. And that's basically the concept of state events, is that they're unique based on their type and state key fields. So this is used to represent all sorts of things. One is membership. One is the name of the room. One is the topic of the room, which is like the description that you see. All sorts of things for the state of the room, which is why it's called room state. And when clients join a room, they get all of this so that they can accurately represent the room in the UI, if they have a UI. Whereas old messages and other events, standard events, they'll only get that old content if they request it from the server.
So if I'm building a product on top of Matrix, you mentioned that the state event for the room membership, room topic, name, etc. But if I'm building a product on top of Matrix, which is not necessarily instant messaging, but I just want to use Matrix as a transport layer, a secure transport layer, can I have an interest in using state events for my specific use case?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it depends on your use case. So I've touched on the difference between standard events and state events. If you need something that will be available to clients immediately when they join the room, and it's something that's some sort of like global value which gets updated over time, and you may not necessarily need the history of it, you always just need the latest state, then state events can be a pretty good mechanism for facilitating that. If you say you want to have the temperature of something like an IoT device in the room, it could go ahead and put that into state. If you want settings for a bot or something that lives in the room, that's a good thing to put into state, because that will always be immediately available if the bot leaves the room and comes back. And yeah, really the possibilities are endless. The only slight niggle with state is that it can uh, clutter up the room a little bit if you send a lot of it. There are some performance usability issues with it, but other than that, it can be very useful for representing data that always needs to be updated in real time.
All right, and we've been discussing building things under the radar, I'd say. So not using fully the Matrix specification, but just sending custom events. But at some point, if I make a product, I might be interested in upstreaming what I created in the Matrix specification, because I want interoperability, for example. So if I have a cool idea on a type of feature to extend the Matrix specification, what should I do?
Right. So what you would like to create is a matrix spec change, which is typically abbreviated as MSC. It's also called a proposal for short. And what one of these things do is they are they're essentially a markdown text document which you can put up in a GitHub repo that we own, and it describes the change that you would like to make. And it doesn't need to be very long. If your change is complicated, then it will probably necessarily get long. But there are MSCs that exist that are only a few paragraphs. And if you are familiar with Git or GitHub, this all exists as a GitHub repo on github.com/matrix-org/matrix spec proposals. And these are pull requests that you make to this repository. And the number of the pull request that gets assigned to you, that will be the number that your MSC gets. So people will typically say, oh, I've written MSC 1234. And what this does is it makes it so that whenever a user joins a room, they get something that assigns them a random emoji to their matrix ID, which obviously is what everyone needs, right? That's what I think anyways. So I will write a text document that says, okay, so this is my idea. I hope you agree with it. Now in detail, how this would work is when the user joins a room, it adds a new field to the membership event, and this should be called m.useremoji, and I don't think that this has any security implications. And you could do this by sending a different event rather than adding it to an existing one, but I think this is better because XYZ. And stuff like that. And you put all of that into a document, and there is a template which we have in that repository, which you can, which basically gives you an example of how this should work, and you can adapt that or start from scratch. And you will create a pull request, which is typically used for code changes, against the repository to insert this document into the proposals folder of the repository. So once that's up there, then it is time for you to get feedback on it. And maybe you wanted to get some initial feedback on this before you went ahead and wrote the proposal. There are forums to do that. You can go into the #matrix spec on matrix.org matrix room, and you can ask people in there, do you think it's a good idea to have user emoji? And if people go, oh, yes, of course, then yeah, maybe create that MSC. Once you've actually got it up in text, though, it's a good idea to get some feedback just from the community, just to make sure you're initially on track. And when you think things are looking pretty good, you can request review from the Spec Core team, which, as mentioned, I'm on. And the job of the Spec Core team is, one of them is to define this whole process, which we're halfway through explaining. The other thing is for them to give a final checkoff on each MSC and to say, yes, okay, I think this looks fine. I'm going to ask the rest of the Spec Core team and we'll see whether it goes in. Or they may say, maybe not. Or we will propose this to a later date, but right now I don't think Matrix is quite ready for your amazing emoji idea. So the Spec Core team consists of 8 members currently. They are documented on matrix.org's website. And you need to, for your proposal to pass, you need to get agreement from at least 75% of these 8 people, which ends up being 6 people. And the process is, it seems complicated, but it's really not. You put it up, you get review, just from community members, and ideally you would get just review from your peers before you call on the Spec Core team to take a look at it and push it through the process. When you're ready to do that, the way you actually say, hi, please review our thing, there's another Matrix room. It's not Matrix Spec, it's Office of the Spec Core team, which is like our virtual office that you can come and say hi. The address for that is office-sct on matrix.org, I believe. And that room is basically used to give us a heads up, to review your MSC or to check on the status of your review. At that point, at least one member of the Spec Core team will come along, they'll review your MSC, and if they think it's okay, they'll propose it to move forward into a new phase. And that is called Final Comment Period, or FCP for short. And what this is it is a period of 5 days, and they're not business days, just regular days, for which, if your MSC passes into here, at the end of that period, it will either be merged or closed or postponed. But typically, it'll be merged, and the reason for that 5-day period is so that anyone, not just Spec Core team members, but anyone can come in and say, hey, wait a minute. Actually, I think we should include these other set of emojis, or, actually, I think users should get 2 emojis, or something like that. And a member of the Spec Core team will see that and say, of course, how are we so blind? And they may cancel the final comment period, and the MSC will go back through review once again, and then hopefully back to FCP once more. So yes, so a proposal of this happens, of final comment period. 75% of the Spec Core team need to agree. Once they do, that will start. If no one complains for 5 days, then the final comment period will end and your MSC will be merged. Oh, fantastic. What happens now? Well, your document has been merged into the Matrix Spec Proposals repo. And that is actually a very important point, because it means you can start using your change with the way you've specified it. So something we haven't touched on yet are unstable prefixes. And this actually really dives into the type field of events that we were talking about earlier. So for instance, let's say I had a new event type that I wanted to specify. And it could be user emoji, or it could be anything really. And I say, okay, this should be m.dogbreed or something. Maybe I think room should have a dog breed specified. And if I want to go ahead and implement this while the spec process is ongoing and my MSC hasn't been merged yet, I can't really use m.dogbreed, because what if there's another MSC out there which is competing for the exact same thing and also says m.dogbreed? Well, maybe our MSCs specify that the event should look slightly differently, and if we start sending these out there, clients won't know what to do when they receive an m.dogbreed, and oh my gosh, it's just going to be chaos. So the way that we get around this is, before your MSC is actually merged, has completed FCP merge, you're not allowed to use any stable identifiers. This doesn't necessarily have to be m dot. It just means something that could conflict with another MSC. So this could be also an endpoint. You need to use unstable identifiers for your endpoints before your MSC has actually been merged. So what this looks like is, instead of, I'll have Matrix client v1 login, can't use that yet because another MSC might be using that. You need to put Matrix client unstable and then some sort of like unstable identifier. So it could be, ANOA /login. And as long as this is a namespace that's unique to you, then no one else should use it. And while your MSC is ongoing, implementations can go ahead and write this code and add this endpoint, and it should be fine. Clients can use this, but obviously once your MSC is eventually merged, then all of those clients and servers and things should switch to what you actually specified in the MSC that says Matrix client v1 login. So that's kind of the deal with unstable prefixes versus stable prefixes. I say prefixes because typically we prefix these, but unstable identifiers and unstable identifiers. So you're allowed to switch from your unstable to stable once FCP merge has been completed. All right, so that's that bit. Finally, once your proposal has been merged, it's not quite in the spec yet, because spec releases go out every quarter, and someone needs to go ahead and write the actual text, which puts your loosey-goosey markdown document into the spec text that gets put on spec.matrix.org. Typically, the Spec Core team does that, but anyone could do it. And all of that happens in a separate repo that's matrix-org/matrix spec. We recently changed those repos. So in succinct words, you have an idea, you get feedback from the community in some sort of forum like the Matrix Spec forum. You go ahead and write a document that says, in loose terms, this is what I want, and then in technical terms, this is exactly how it will be implemented, so everyone is on the same page. You go ahead and put that document up on the Matrix Spec proposals repo. You get feedback from other people, make sure you get all your typos out of the way, and then you go ahead and request the Spec Core team to take a look at it. If one of the members are happy with it, then they will propose final comment period. The rest of the Spec Core team then comes along, and as long as 75% agree with that individual, then final comment period will start. That will go on for 5 days, and as long as nobody has raised any concerns, then that will complete. You can, at this point, start using the stable identifiers that you mentioned in your MSC. You can use them privately, but you can't use those publicly, like sending them out into the world until that happens, lest it conflict with other people. And at that point, you're basically able to use your idea in the wild. It will eventually arrive in a spec release, but you don't necessarily need to wait for that. Some client and server implementations might prefer to wait for that, but you don't have to. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. There's some more small details, such as there are some other requirements to get into FCP, which the Spec Core Team members can inform you of. And you can find a lot of this information on spec.matrix.org. We do have a page that really goes into the detail about the proposals. And obviously, you can always ask us questions in the Matrix Spec room. But that's about it.
That's very detailed explanation of the spec process, but it's very complete. So one of the very interesting things you said, among many other interesting things, is that community can review the spec proposals before the spec core team actually does. So when you say community, it can be anybody?
Yeah, sure. Anyone that wants to take an interest in making the Matrix spec more extensible, or cleaning it up, or any of the ideas that happen to be out there, they can go ahead and leave a pull request review. They do need a GitHub account, but it's free to make one. And you can go ahead and say, this sounds good, or actually, I think maybe it would be better if we did this, or have you considered this alternative, and so on and so forth. And because the Spec Core team is so small at the moment, and there are literally hundreds of MSCs waiting for review, it really helps the Spec Core team when the community goes ahead and leaves reviews. If you're not sure about something, do ask about it in the Matrix Spec room beforehand. Don't just leave a bunch of comments all over the place, because that's also work that needs to be cleaned up. But if you think you have a pretty good grasp on the subject, go ahead and leave a review. And if you think you don't, you go ahead and ask in the Matrix channels, and we can help fill in that knowledge.
So you said the Spec Core team, was small at the moment. It's 8 members.
Mm-hmm.
And a difficult question for you. 7 of those 8 members are hired by Element. Doesn't this mean that Element is going to be favored over community or other third-party MSCs?
Not necessarily. Essentially, what we do have to do with that situation is ensure that we are bipartisan and partial to the community MSCs. I mean, so the Matrix.org Foundation is effectively acting as a neutral party. We are being paid by Element, but if Element, so I work for Element. If a coworker comes along and says, "Oh, hey, we really need this MSC to finish our feature, which we promised, blah, 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 blah," all this enterprise stuff, it's my job to say, "That's cool, but sorry, we are prioritizing this. Please ask in the office of the Spec Core team room like everyone else." And we do that, and it frustrates people. And yeah, it makes sometimes we miss deadlines. But that is essentially the reality of the situation. And we do that to the best of our ability. But there is a system in place such that if we do end up being nefarious, then we don't have the final say of what actually goes into the spec. There is the Matrix.org Guardians, which we haven't touched on yet, but this is a group of 5 people, of which Element is not a majority in, that do check into the internal Spec Core team workings, and they will say, "Hey, isn't it a bit odd that you've been working on this, customer specific feature for X amount of time, and, other things haven't been getting time?" And we'll be like, "Whoa, sorry." They say, "Ha, knock it off. Okay, or we'll revoke your power." So they do have final say on what actually happens, which is supposed to be the legal precedent for preventing any party that does have a majority in the Spec Core team from being able to take it over. Obviously, the spec process is slow, and we are trying in our monthly retros to figure out ways to make it faster with the small amount of people we have. Part of that is literally giving up company development time to instead dedicate to spec reading time, which we've been doing more of lately. And the other part of it is just ensuring that if there is a project that requires spec, a spec to actually get through FCP, trying to reel that back and making sure it's like, okay, well, can we put this out with unstable prefixes, just so that it doesn't put pressure on the Spec Core team from a company perspective. Even if we can push back, just not creating that situation in the first place is obviously ideal. In terms of adding more people to the Spec Core team, that is something we would like to do, but also counterintuitively reduces flexibility, just because there's more people that need to check off, and people aren't always available. Part of that is changing the process. We've talked about internally breaking up the team into sub-teams. Maybe there's a team focused on servers and a team focused on clients, and you only need to get a majority from those rather than the encryption team, which aren't really involved here. A lot of that is things that we would like to do, but is also something that is like indicative of a much larger process, which we're trying not to head too much into while we can still move fast, because you get more bureaucracy. There's a lot that goes into actually making the spec process faster, and another part of it is just having this conversation with the community and having it in a way that's not disruptive. So watch this space is what I can say. Anyway, that's a very long answer to your question, but it's hopefully better.
And that's actually good news from my perspective, because that means you have too much work, and that means Matrix is too successful.
There are a lot of MSCs, and we really appreciate everyone that comes in, and we do internally prioritize them and then also externally prioritize them on our Spec Core Team backlog board, which is on GitHub. But it is a large task, and being smart about how you can handle that with a small team is something we're always striving to do.
Right. Is there anything you want to add on the spec itself or the spec process before we move into my final silly question?
I do just want to try and stress that this process is really not that complicated. There are a lot of little technicalities, and obviously it's a bit vague, just so that we don't get merged down in like this specific rule that stops X company from shipping a thing that ideally it probably should have if people just had a conversation about it. Do engage with the process. Don't assume that there are certain people that can drive this. Obviously we have titles as a Spec Core team, and obviously there are community members that are very involved, more than others, but really anyone can have their say, and do try to be constructive when you put your opinion forward. It makes it easier for everyone.
All right, so let's go with the silly question. Do you have a personal wish list for Matrix, features you'd like to see specified or implemented that have not been specified or implemented?
Yes, I do in my notes, because this is something that I think about every day. Oh gosh, yes, I'll pick a few from these. The top one I really want is custom emojis, because I think that will be engaging for a lot of different communities that use separate platforms. And a lot of those platforms require money to use that feature, and that's not really what we're about here at Matrix. So it would be really nice and not very difficult to implement custom emojis in Matrix. I would really like encrypted state events, because right now, we talked about state events. Things like the room topic is not encrypted. It is known to your server admin when you join a room. That is a little bit complicated, but something that we could certainly do and would unlock a lot of different other applications where we want to put sensitive data into state events that are always readily available to clients. Native group VoIP signaling. I wanted to replace Jitsi for so long. Not that I don't like Jitsi. I think it's great, and I use it for all sorts of things outside of Matrix, but it would be really great to have native Matrix end-to-end encrypted calling built into our Matrix clients. And I look forward to seeing both what we do with the full mesh stuff, but also beyond with massively big calls with a bunch of people. So that spec helps facilitate that. Portable identities. I might want to move my account between home servers, or I might want my account to exist on multiple home servers, or I might want to have multiple identities that exist on the same home server. Blah. I would think this is obviously useful for the peer-to-peer use case as well. But it's been sticking around for a while, mostly because it's quite complicated. But I would just love to see it move forward in the near future. Profiles as rooms, there was spec discussion about member pronouns, having that available without having to put it in your display name. There's so many things that I would like to associate with my profile that other chat services can do, but this can also be useful if you have an IoT device and you want it to, have certain statistics that are kept up to date and are just specific to that device. I would love to have a room that is my profile room, and it would just contain whatever arbitrary data I wanted to describe about myself. And probably the last thing is sync v3, which has now been renamed to sliding sync. Sync can sometimes be slow on big accounts such as mine that are in over 1,000 rooms, and I cannot wait for that to be quick, especially when I was skiing recently and there was poor internet, and oh my goodness, it took forever to sync all the time. So those are some of my favorite MSCs that are upcoming.
All right. Thanks a lot, Sandru. It's been a very interesting Matrix Live, and I hope it's much clearer for people who have been following it, how to add features to Matrix, how to extend the spec, or how to participate in the spec process, even if you are not adding a feature yourself. Because if you care about Matrix and want to help, you can help by reviewing MSCs where you are a sort of expert, or not necessarily an expert, but where you are knowledgeable. So thanks a lot for your time, and thanks a lot for that list of specifications that could give people ideas on things to work on to help Matrix going forward. And I'll see you around Matrix Live.
Thanks, Matrix Live. Bye.